Great. Well, welcome again to everyone who has gathered here today for this promise of an absolutely wonderful conversation. How could it be any other way with the names and the people you see here? My name is Prabha Shankarnarayan. I am CEO of Mediators Beyond Borders and one of the co-conveners of the Trust Network. I want to take a couple of minutes just to share with you what the Trust Network is, and then we'll move to letting Maria and Julia take over the presentation. Please know that this is being recorded, and that if you choose not to have your recording, you can, of course, turn off your cameras, do whatever you need to not be on screen. Okay. All right. So here we go. Let's see if I can do this quickly. As you may know, it was about 6 months ago, and it feels like 600 sometimes, that in the past year of activities, that a group of us came together to form the Trust Network, which we designed to be filling a gap in the United States, particularly for an early warning, early response system, while at the same time building a national cohesion and security infrastructure architecture, with the idea of taking this moment to transform all that was happening in the country, both in terms of its strengths and resilience, as well as in relation to the activities that continued to lead to both acts of violence and continued polarization, which happens to be the topic of the conversation today. Believing that we need a coordinated, multi-sectoral peace-building approach, formed this platform that is a bipartisan one, that is focused on local convenings. And the partners you will see are on the Trust Network page, which we will also put in the chat box very quickly. The way it works is really to have a core group of national and international conflict transformation organizations with all of the wonderful experiences that they bring in. And the idea has been that we all have a lot to learn from each other. There is a wealth of research, practice, and expertise that we bring together as a community. And that is what this series is focused on. While there is a group that meets on Tuesdays at 2 o'clock, the Friday series is focused on knowledge and information sharing amongst all of us. So with that, I am going to thank the people who made it possible for us to initiate this network last year, and then shift to Maria, who is going to lead us in conversation for the next 86 minutes.
Thanks, Prabha. I think Julia is going to kick us off.
Yeah, just very briefly. Thank you so much, Prabha, and really a joy to be together this afternoon, this Friday. I'm Julia Roig, and I'm the president of Partners Global. I'm based here in Washington, DC, outside of Washington. And we're one of the organizations behind a new initiative in the United States called the Horizons Project. And if you're not familiar with Partners Global, we're a non-for-profit that's been around for about 30 years now. We function as a network. And so while I'm the head of Partners Global, we have a network of affiliated organizations around the world dedicated to peace building and democracy building, conflict resolution, conflict transformation. And we function as a bit of a franchise model. Partners Colombia, Partners Bulgaria. I have to mention Partners Poland because I saw that the director of Partners Poland is with us today. And we're now working on the challenges in the United States, specifically with the Horizons Project, trying to break down the barriers as we all are trying to get out of our silos between movement leaders, those who are working on democracy building, those who are committed to human rights, and of course the peace building field. And while we find that there are many ways that we connect with each other, there are also a lot of challenges finding each other, sharing resources, sharing best practices, and of course, a lot of the great research that we know is out there with regards to how these different fields approach our work. And so we're very much aligned and in common cause with the Trust Network, and we're thrilled to be helping to support this knowledge sharing. So thank you so much, Prabha, for allowing us to be together. Maria is the senior advisor for the
good. We can't do it right.
I'll share some more information about the Horizons project in the chat. But with that, I'm just really very grateful and thrilled that our colleagues chose to be with us today. And thank you, Maria, for leading the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Julia, and thanks, Prabha, for that welcome. I'm thrilled to be both, I guess, a founding member of the Trust Network, while at the same time now being a member of the Horizons Project in a senior advisor role. And you know, I'm just excited to be part of a community that's interested in kind of busting silos between the social justice, democracy, peace building, human rights communities in the US, because God knows we need all hands on deck and we need each other to be able to solve the most pressing issues and crises that we face. And so it's just wonderful to be part of various initiatives that are really about building dialogue and solidarity between you know, groups that traditionally work on peace building, social justice, advocacy, democracy, to be able to address these problems together. And you know, this topic of polarization is such a big one. And I was just part of a Council on Foreign Relations call the other day about the crisis of democracy in the US, and they started the webinar with a poll, a public poll, and they were asking, you know, folks, what do you consider to be like the #1 problem of democracy in the US? And deep toxic polarization was #1 or #2 in the poll. And so it's certainly, you know, gathering a lot of attention. And you know, is considered very much a huge challenge to our democracy and to the foundations of our democracy. So I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to probe this issue of polarization and toxic polarization more deeply today with Peter Coleman and Tabitha Moore, who will be looking at it from more of a, you know, scholarly academic perspective, but also a deeply practical and practitioner perspective on the issue of polarization. And so just to give you a sense of how, you know, the next hour or so is going to go, I'm going to lead a conversation with Peter and with Tabitha, and we'll talk for 30 minutes or so. And then we very much, you know, want to dedicate a good chunk of time to engaging with you all. So encourage you all to use the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to start to, you know, add any questions, comments that you may have over the course of our conversation. And I'll be sure to, you know, move us along and be able to get to as many of your questions and observations as possible over the course of the conversation. So let me start by introducing our two fantastic panelists for today's conversation. I'll start with Dr. Peter Coleman. Peter Coleman is a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University and a very well-known social psychologist and conflict resolution scholar. He is the director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution and the co-director of the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Peter has authored over a gazillion different articles and chapters. He's a member of the United Nations Mediation Support Unit's Academic Advisory Council and is a founding board member of the Gabawi Peace Foundation USA. And he is a New York State certified mediator and experienced consultant. His most recent book, because he's written a number of those, Making Conflict Work, Navigating Disagreement Up and Down Your Organization, won the 2016 Outstanding Book Award from the International Association of Conflict Management. And he has a new book coming out this June entitled, appropriately for this conversation today, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. So welcome, Peter. Our second panelist, Tabitha Moore, hails from the great state of Vermont, where she focuses on the intersection of individual and community identity development and systemic oppression. Tabitha has dedicated her life's work to studying systems from the inside, working as a licensed couple and family therapist, a former law enforcement official and school counselor, and she now acts as a trainer for child welfare workers. Tabitha is raising her 3 children and working on her PhD in transformative social change, where she will focus her research on how systems inhibit or promote healthy connections. She's the former president of the Rutland, Vermont chapter of the NAACP, and a very well-known and respected advocate for racial and social justice in Vermont. And just as an aside, Tabitha and I were actually high school classmates together, and I'm really thrilled that she is part of the research team for the Horizons Project. And I'd also note, really proud to say that both Peter and Tabitha are members of the Brain Trust for the Horizons Project, so it's really exciting to be able to showcase their work and experiences today. So we'll kick off the conversation, Peter, maybe by just asking you about the whole kind of challenge notion of polarization and start to diagnose the problem a little bit together. So the term polarization has become somewhat of a contested one here in the US, as Julia mentioned in her opening remarks. So I just wanted to ask you how you would describe polarization that would be considered normal or healthy in a functioning democracy, and when does it become toxic or dangerous? And like, which aspects of polarization do you find particularly concerning for the United States right now?
Thank you. Good to be here. Nice to see some of you. So my background is an academic and a practitioner. I'm a mediator and do some practical work. I'm mostly an academic. I mostly do research. So I'll try to answer that question from what the science says. So that, you know, polarization is a natural phenomenon that's seen in different areas of science. It's, you know, originally sort of identified in physics, like the study of magnetism, where light or heat or filaments will move in opposite directions away from each other, usually, you know, attracted and repelled by different poles, right? So from a practical perspective, polarization is what we feel when we feel repulsed by somebody or their actions or their opinions or attitudes, or drawn to another group. So, so it is a healthy force in any kind of society, to a point. We need to have, obviously, differences of opinion. We need to have groups that sort of represent and advocate for tradition and stability and you know, sort of holding on to a sense of identity, and we need forces that advocate for change and reform and progress. And it's oftentimes those forces, you know, in tension that we get to a more perfect union, we move forward. So we need that kind of process. There was a time in the 1950s when there was a lot of criticism of the Democratic and Republican Party because there was insufficient distinction between the two, and they felt like it was sort of one overlapping party, and obviously we're not at that anymore. But really since the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, we've seen a trajectory of increasing political polarization. Polarization is, you know, the way it's studied is it's studied in pieces. So there's what's known as affective polarization, which is, again, a feeling of warmth for your side and coldness or contempt for the other side. There's ideological polarization, where our beliefs or values around certain issues diverge. There's perceptual polarization, which is the degree to which you see the other side as, you know, extreme versus your side. Political polarization is usually kind of tribalism. It's when your political affiliation informs most of your choices. And most importantly, I think for us these days, there is, cultural or structural polarization where you actually start to see geographic sorting, either physically or virtually on the internet, which is more and more of a phenomenon where you see divisions, not just rural urban divisions, but even within cities, you'll see red and blue voters segregate into different kinds of communities. So all of those are aspects of polarization, and there are various measures that track them. So toxic polarization is really just it's a made up term, right? But it's basically a state of more destructive, chronic polarization where there's high levels of contempt for the other and love for one's own side. There's usually dysfunctional decision-making, and it's a trap. It's like an addiction. We get stuck in this biopsychosocial structure that we feel like we can't get out of. And it informs our basic decision-making processes and become highly problematic. You asked what the most severe trends are, concerning trends. I would cite a few. Again, depending on what you're measuring and what you're tracking, there's evidence that this is at least a 50-year trend, upward trend of polarization. And that's true in Washington if you look at voting patterns over time, and it's true in terms of political attitudes on the streets of small towns. We've seen high spikes in affective polarization. That's usually what's measured as a proxy for polarization, again, which is sort of, contempt for the other side, fear of the other side, and love for one's own side. There are also, though, increases in what we call ideological consistency, which is Pew research measures 10 divisive issues, and they measure your attitudes on those issues, and they've tracked this over time. And what we're seeing more and more is the collapse within partisan groups across those 10 issues, so that immigration and environmentalism and homosexual rights are all become highly correlated with one another, which means that, and so you see this sort of collapse within groups, and you see, a spread between groups, which means that these highly complex issues are, we're paying much less attention to the specifics, the realities, the complexity of these issues. And we're really just sort of following a theme that our, tribe advocates. So there's increases in that. There's decreases in what we call social identity complexity, or another way to say it is there's overlaps between our political identities and oftentimes our racial identities, our religious identities. So you see sort of a fusion of that. And then two other things, again, I would say, one is there is a trend today where there is an outside effect of the extreme wings on what we talk about, on what we pay attention to. So there is control by smaller groups that are noisy, contentious, which sort of shape the discourse and shape our understanding and our fears, and a demotivation of many in the middle. And then finally, again, I think the most concerning thing is this sorting that we see, this virtual and geographic sorting of moving away from each other. There was a study done by PredictWise in 2018 that just looked at all the counties, the 3,000 counties in America. And one of the things they found is the main predictor of political tolerance and intolerance was the degree to which you had, what we call cross-cutting structures. You had like mixed political marriages. And so the counties with more of these kind of points of contact between red and blue voters, sports teams, labor unions, workplaces, where you were in contact with others, where you live in those spaces, right? Not temporary contact, but where people have to live together and grow together. Those are the most tolerant places. And other places like Florida, for the state, not to pick on Florida, but it's highly polarized by this ranking. And part of that is because neighborhoods are so clustered, right? So it's these structures that become, very difficult to change for a variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Peter, thanks for that overview of the different trends associated with toxic polarization. I was really intrigued by a recent article that you wrote for Scientific American, and hopefully somebody can drop the link in the chat for the article. But in that piece, you wrote that it might actually be a good thing that the US is suffering from toxic polarization. And you wrote, and I quote, that studies have shown that chronic divisive patterns like ours often become more susceptible to change after major disruptions to the status quo, similar to what we are experiencing today. So can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so this is a theory that actually came out of biology, and it's a model of change that exists in different areas: organizational science, human development, and then war and peace. And it recognizes that most, for example, societies stabilize more or less at some kind of equilibrium. They're kind of at the status quo, and you get changes at the margins, but basically you have the status quo until something dramatic happens. There is a dramatic shock to that system, and that destabilizes the system, which leads to kind of a cascading set of changes. And then after a delay, you see a dramatic change. So in the international affairs world, there's work by Paul Diehl and Gary Getz, political scientists, and they study this thing called the Correlates of War database, which is a 200-year-long database of how nation states treat one another. And what they found is that somewhere between 75 and 90% of the more, what they call enduring rivalries, long-term intractable relationships that are destructive, that last 40, 50 years, the vast majority of those actually change and change course within 10 years of a political shock, a political assassination, a coup attempt, some major, even major positive things. The end of the Cold War was a political shock. So when these things happen, they destabilize, and it challenges our theories of change, right? Because it's not that you see an event like COVID and then you see a dramatic change. You see an event like COVID and racial injustice in America and the Trump administration and a variety of other things simultaneously. There's tremendous instability, and then that leads to a sequence of changes that can, under certain conditions, lead to dramatic positive change. It can also make things worse, right? Because 90% of the more intractable conflicts that we see in the world actually started 10 years after some major political shock. So all this says is that this is a time when we should be thinking about what are the deeper decision structures that we as a people need to really take seriously, alter, because this is a ripe opportunity, a ripe time for us to pivot.
All right, thank you. That invitation to use this moment as one to look deeper and look at kind of the deeper structural issues is, I think, a very welcome one. Tabitha, turning to you, maybe to offer a bit more of a kind of grassroots perspective on this topic and some of the trends of toxic polarization. There's this common expression in activism that you polarize to organize. And you're deeply involved in social justice work in Vermont, and would be just curious how you react to that slogan, and what have you observed about kind of trends towards more toxic forms of polarization and in Vermont and beyond?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, Vermont is not immune, despite our reputation here for toxic polarization infiltrating all aspects, whether it is between groups or within groups, even within the activist movement. I see that quite a bit here. But as far as the way it's conceptualized on the ground, polarization can be a really wonderful tool to identify where everybody kind of falls on a continuum as far as belief in particular human rights. Not necessarily are you with us or against us, but how do you promote or inhibit people being able to get their basic needs met, which is where I'm most often seeing it come up here. So first, I was really glad that you talked earlier about silos, because I really see toxic polarization as one of those things that uphold silos. And my work as somebody who kind of walks between worlds, I see toxic polarization as one of those things that really prevents us from taking down those barriers and really humanizing each other in ways that help us see what the other needs. So as far as Vermont and what am I seeing on the ground here, I have some examples of healthy polarization as well as unhealthy polarization. One of the unhealthy ones we were kind of talking a little bit about before we got on the call, and high schools across the nation are really seeing this with trying to raise the Black Lives Matter flag as an indicator that Black lives matter, right? Just trying to indicate that there is inequity there. And the ways that it's kind of coming out here, at least 2 high schools we were just talking about since August in Vermont have experienced extreme polarization around the issue. In our local community, one political candidate actually used it as a tool. He used polarizing the community around the Black Lives Matter flag in schools as one of his major platform points, and he won. So it was incredible, and it's divided the entire community in ways that were unexpected, and we're seeing it play out in other areas across the school as well now, because it was such an effective use of toxic polarization. Some of the other ways that we're seeing it are around law enforcement, right? And the Blue Lives Matter, which, the insurrection tamped that down a bit, and people realizing that, oh wait, law enforcement has been weaponized again against government or against people of color in ways that they could not, that they tried to pretend that it wasn't happening before. Again, locally in Vermont, we have some great examples of healthy polarization as well. One of the ways that we're seeing it play out is through COVID-19. And I think Peter mentioned that with COVID-19 and the murder or the killing of George Floyd, about Aubrey Breonna Taylor, people really started to pay attention to the ways that racism is impacting health. So here in Vermont, that's been used as a way to create more movement around declaring racism to be a public health crisis, which would allow for more access to resources to deal with and dismantle it from a systemic perspective. But activists have been very clear, like, as all these numbers come out about COVID, and we're seeing the disparities, not just, in terms of death rate or access to resources and vaccines, but also in terms of the parallels between how lethal it is in general, and being able to say, this is what racism looks like, this is what COVID-19 looks like. How do you not understand that racism is the same type of an epidemic? And people are really kind of using it as an opportunity to draw that line in the sand on the ground and say, do you stand for this, yes or no? Whether it's pushing legislators and lawmakers to take that stand and be honest and clear about where they are, it can be used for good. Another place that I see it is with the Vermont State Police. They actually developed a policy maybe 3 or 4 years ago where a trooper who witnesses potentially discriminatory behavior on the part of another trooper is to be held just as accountable as the trooper who committed the infraction. So ways of saying either you are on the side of justice, or you are potentially committing a crime or potentially harming other people, is a way that I'm also seeing people use that pressure to force change, systemic change around here.
Those are really interesting examples. Thank you, Tabitha. And you mentioned that one of the challenges with toxic polarization is that it encourages itself, thus the siloing that we're talking about. That it's actually, a cause of a lot of it. And that happens both within movements and, between movements and, other authority groups or governments and the like. So where have you kind of seen that playing out even in the movement space? And why is that a challenge to social justice organizing?
It's really fascinating, because one of the ways that it's playing out here in Vermont now is around racial justice. And it's, I always come back to Audre Lorde saying that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, because what I see happening is that we're using toxic polarization to try to solve the problem or resolve the issue of lack of resources, of all of the things that Peter said, the cultural, the affective ways that people are discriminated against here. And when we get a small piece of the pie or a piece of the puzzle or a seat at the table, what's happening is that there are so many people who are being harmed, is that we have to determine who gets a seat at that table, who's going to be there to make the decisions. And in the realm of racial justice, I'm even hearing people talking about phenotype, using phenotype as a deciding factor for who gets to speak. As a way, because we're still arguing over crumbs because we get 1 seat versus the fact that, we probably need 8 or 10 of the 15 that exist. And so I'm seeing that kind of polarization happening, that like seriously taking phenotype into consideration in deciding how long somebody gets to speak. I mean, we see it with nationally, right? With, was it Randall Robinson's model for reparations? And again, the way that we're going about it, the way that we're going about dealing with these issues is so to me, reminiscent of the master's tools, that we're polarizing. We're polarizing ourselves even within the movement and starting to fracture. And so I look at that within movement group, and my concern is that the people that would do harm, that want to maintain systems of hierarchy, maintain systems of resource allocation that are inequitable, use that against the movement. One of the other things that I see around here is the levying of the term Black supremacist. Like all of a sudden there's white supremacists, so there must be Black supremacists. And we had a candidate for governor who referred to myself, Susanna Davis, who is our racial equity director for the state, Kaya Morris, who was our lone Black woman legislator. Anybody who's speaking up against.
Oops, Tabitha, you just put yourself on mute.
No, somebody muted. I don't know. I'm back. So what we're noticing is that people are starting to use these polarizing terms as ways to silence the movement externally and within. So.
Yeah, no, that's interesting and troubling, especially on the phenotype example that you used as being kind of a silencer. Well, we've dedicated the first kind of chunk to talking about the kind of the analysis of the problem and the different trends. And so I wanted to turn the conversation now to kind of what to do about it practically, and how these understandings should inform our work and our interventions, whether it's in the peace building, social justice, democracy spaces. So start with you, Peter. There's often this idea that kind of the antidote to polarization is bridge building. And yet we know that examples of bridge building that lead to wide scale realignment, social change are pretty few and far between in the US. So, in your view, what are the potential and the limitations of bridge building in a deeply polarized setting like what we have in the United States? And have you seen it work, meaning bridge building, work in other societies in a way that could provide some guidance for the US?
Yeah, so I think certainly bridge building is, bridge building under the right conditions is, I think, a critical component of any kind of what I would advocate for, like a public health plan. So I think, this pattern that we're stuck on, that we're referring to as toxic polarization, is a complicated pattern, right? And there are a variety of different things that kind of feed each other in ways that we don't really understand, but it's a strong pattern and it resists change. And so it's not going to be solved by dialogue alone, right? So I do think that I am a critic of some of the organizations that just encourage people to kind of get together and talk to, if you're a pro-Trump or an anti-Trump, just have a cup of coffee and talk it out, because I think those things blow up under the conditions where the conflict is so important and deep and people are so angry. So I think, we've learned from the study of contact theory over decades, the conditions under which those things go well or go poorly, and the kinds of contact and the kinds of dialogues that matter are ones that take time, right? If you're really trying to transform, that's why I was emphasizing these structures where people live together and work together and play together and worship together, because it's that kind of long-term relationship that can lead to the conditions where people will, humanize the other side. So I think bridge building components are part of this. But again, I want to be clear, we are in an urgent time. And I do think that we need to be mindful of the constellation of activities that we need to encourage, support, identify, and mobilize that can help the cause of, basically holding on to democracy, decreasing toxic polarization, and then getting back to work in some of the major crises that we're facing, like climate change and inequality and other things. So, bridge building is a component of that. I'm a fan of groups that come from local needs, right? That spring in communities because there's a polarizing problem that they face. And if they're effective, they maybe pivot to other problems. And oftentimes it's not just conversations, they're sustained conversations, and they organize and mobilize to take something on, to take a housing problem on, or to take a labor gathering place on. And it's those kinds of initiatives, I think, that not just that move beyond talk and that allow people to start to take action together. And that kind of process, research tells us, matters considerably, right? One of the things I'll say quickly is, you asked me about, are there other examples of this? And I think that's true, but one of the things that our research is showing us these days is that a basic staple that we in our field often do, well, in our field of conflict resolution, let me be clear, which is to sit down and talk to people, is sometimes inefficient and ineffective under these circumstances, with these kinds of conflicts. And in fact, what some evidence is suggesting is that what we really need to do is move together. We need to get up and move together, ideally outside. And I think activists understand this, because activists march, right, together in unison in the same direction and outside. And there is something about the simple act of doing that which synchronizes people neurologically, it synchronizes them emotionally, it elicits more cooperation, so we know that, yet we still try to sit people down and have these conversations, which most of the time is useful, but not under these conditions. I'll flag, so you ask about other examples, or, one of the areas of research that I have a team that works on is what we call sustainably peaceful societies. So we are looking at societies around the world like Mauritius and Costa Rica and New Zealand and Scandinavian countries. And, there are nations, small societies and nation states and clusters of nations, what we call peace systems around the world that have sustained peace for 70, 80, 100, 200, 300 years. So we've been studying them. And a lot of, the components that we know of, like having, taboos and norms that are guardrails for political discourse, like having structures where people come together, right, in school and other places where, inter-ethnic mixing happens, like having certain kinds of political systems, voting systems that aren't so as easily polarizing. It doesn't all come down to one or the other, dichotomous voting. So these countries are mindful of these things. But what's interesting about the study of these countries is they don't rest on their laurels. These are nations that oftentimes came out of a crisis like ours, intentionally chose to pivot with leadership, but recognize that peace, sustaining peace between different groups in places where disagreements and differences always happen, takes work. It takes considerable work. Mauritius, we just released a case study on Mauritius, and it's a very interesting place. It's a very multicultural island. It's the most peaceful nation in Africa. It has a history of indentured servitude and slavery, but it's a nation that is dealing with that, is addressing that, and they're very conscious of how their media and how their conversations in public spaces affect one another. And certainly in America, we've sort of lost a sense of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was really intrigued by what you said about, going beyond talking and moving together. And I think there can be so much interesting learning between activist social justice kind of communities and peace builders, just about the power of ritual, the power of collective action and marching, and just how that can, kind of build bonds of humanity and understanding and things like that. So that was a really interesting perspective. And the other, the point about being practical. I often think about this when it comes to kind of bridge building work and what can really move us back past this toxicity, the toxic nature of polarization, is just like solving problems together locally, like really focusing on doing stuff and solving things together. And I just wonder, and I'd be curious, Tabitha, your perspective kind of on, various interventions that you maybe see that are working or that hold promise in Vermont. Is there something to that? And how do you think about bridge building work in Vermont?
I definitely think that it's all about getting out there and doing it together. I think that there's nothing that builds trust more than doing that. I also think that it's got to be focused on meeting particular needs. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Abenaki Nation here, their emergency funding was completely depleted. And Chief Stevens reached out to me when I was head of the NAACP and said, you know, is there anything that you can do? And it was really interesting because as I evolved in my role with racial justice, I really started to realize we will never be able to heal racial injustice until we are dealing with what has happened to the Indigenous people here, period. A lot of people will say that slavery is the original sin. It is not. It is the decimation of the cultures and the people here. We need to revive, we need to breathe life, we need to support in every way we can Indigenous cultures. And so that's what we did. And that's where we started donating more of our finances to, because that's what they needed. When there was legislation about Abenaki being able to fish and hunt on their own land for free without license, we support each other's initiatives. So that's, even within group, because BIPOC, right, we're all kind of lumped together as not white, which we could talk about that all day. But it's when we show up in person for each other that we start to build those relationships, when we start to center their needs as much as we center our own and realize that it's actually the same need. That's where we're most effective. And that's within activist movements, right? And then we look at the peace building, the relationship between peace building and activism here in Vermont. We have less than 700,000 people in the whole state. And there we are 94-point-something% white. So when you're looking at a racial justice movement, and you can't look at Robert's rules, you can't look at majority rules as a way to decide whether or not we're doing a good job. It has to be a concentrated effort of uplifting those voices here. And so the peace building movement here, there are a few entities and organizations that are big on peace building, but it looks like it's just one entity all moving together, because we know that one can't exist without the other. And the same thing between social justice movements. We were the NAACP and other organizations, Justice for All around our state, are quite big in the environmental justice movement as well. We have to support each other. We have to show up, give our time, give our resources, however small they may be, because that's what creates the relationship and humanizes need with each other. And I think what it sends to the majority is, if we can support each other like this and give each other what we need, what are you doing? You have all the resources and tools, and we're making it work over here. So imagine if you gave up what's not even yours to begin with, and redistributed that power, authority, and resources. So that's kind of what I'm seeing, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Tabitha, just the idea. I mean, in part because it's a small population, people are wearing multiple hats, but the peace building community, the activist community, it's, very intermeshed and very, there's a lot of strong overlap between these communities. And that's actually an interesting model. And I know this, is happening locally in a lot of places across the US, where there's just for practical reasons, these groups and communities have to be in communion and in dialogue and working together. But that's really interesting. And just this notion of solidarity, feeling a sense of solidarity with other groups, and that we're kind of all in it together. So I wanted to probe a little bit more on this. We talked about kind of, as aspects of toxic polarization, this idea of kind of extreme dehumanization and oversimplification of very complex issues, shutting down curiosity about the other and kind of creating these rigid in-groups and out-groups. So how can we go about humanizing the other in such a deeply polarized setting that we have in the US, in ways that could perchance, help forestall violence and kind of help reduce very binary Black versus white ideas of identity and narrative that exist currently? So Peter, maybe start with you and then ask Tabitha as well.
You're muted.
Oh, you're on mute, Peter.
Thank you. Those are my best comments. So, what I want to share is, I guess, sort of my theory of change about this problem, this wicked problem of toxic polarization, which is that we need a lot of different kinds of activities. What I'm focusing on in my work right now, in this book that's about to come out, is really specifically what I would call growing the middle. So one of the things we've identified from the study of long-term protracted conflicts in the international space is that there are kind of 2 or 3 conditions under which parties are willing to kind of come together and consider change. And that is if they're miserable and exhausted, good news, we are, right? So More in Common's study has in 2018 found that something like 93% of the middle are this exhausted majority, you know, what I call the miserable majority. And so there are Americans of all stripes, you know, it crosses political, ideological divides, who are fed up. They're tired of the dysfunction, they're tired of the vitriol, they're tired of the screaming matches, and they want something else. So that condition is, you know, currently being met. But the other thing that they need is sort of some clear sense of what to do. Like, what's the alternative? What is a way out of this that where I don't have to give up too much, you know, jeopardize or compromise my values, lose face, you know, what's possible? And so, you know, that's where I think certainly the democracy building or bridge building, or, you know, there's these various community-based groups come into play, because these are groups that are what Laura Chason used to call networks of effective action. There are groups that are currently having conversations across the divide, having Monday breakfasts and talking about these issues, you know, bringing people together to take on projects. And so there, it's evidence of the fact that this is possible and that there are others doing it. One of the things we've learned from studying Israel-Palestine is that if you believe that the situation isn't going to change, that they're never going to change, and I'm never going to change, then guess what? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You disengage or you just fight. If you see that the other side, some of the other side are sometimes willing to make a difference, to pivot, to have some doubt, to question their assumptions, it moves in us the motivation to really engage with them and try, right? So I think seeing what is happening, you know, the Princeton Bridging Divides initiative that Neil Parker has organized maps. Currently, I think the count is 7,000 groups around the country that are doing work. Now, of course, they're not all doing necessarily excellent work, but they're doing things to try to bring people together, right? And many of them are doing fantastic work, evidence-based work, there's metrics, there's clear theories of change, right? So part of it is just beginning to identify who those are so that people can start to see, well, there are people that are making a difference, that are reaching across in ways that where we don't have to compromise and give up everything, right? So it doesn't mean, you know, I mean, one of the premises that I argue for in my book is the need for us to start to think with the best on the other side, right? So we because of the media echo chambers that exist, the parallel systems that exist, we talk to, listen to, learn from so few others on the other side. And I think that's a huge component of the problem. And so our willingness to identify 2 or 3 other people who have very different political opinions from us, but who you feel are decent, smart people, and remain in conversations with them, the better our understanding of ourselves, the other side, the issues gets, right? We become more nuanced and complicated. One of the things Laura Chason mentioned to me when she would organize these dialogues of polarized communities is that oftentimes the activists that she would work with would say to them after long-term dialogue processes that this was actually the first time in a long time that they actually reflected on some of their own ambivalence about their positions and the unintended consequences of their actions and what they did, because they were in a space where they could do that. Because when you're an activist, you are about simplifying, you are about saying, this is what we need to do to mobilize, let's go. There is no room or space for those kinds of conversations, and yet those ambiguities are there. And so having some opportunity to engage in those is critical.
Yeah, that's helpful, Peter. I mean, it's interesting though, because also from the world of activism and kind of social justice work is the whole notion of intersectionality. So the complexity and making connections between issues and the roots of conflict that hadn't been done by a lot of different groups. And so on the one hand, there's like an urge to simplify and kind of to mobilize, but at the same time, there's often a depth of, thinking on the interconnectedness of issues as well. And and the thing I'd be curious to hear Tabitha's, thoughts on this. So on the one hand, you mentioned, Peter, like coming up with the alternative where, you don't have to give up too much. And there's something about that, yet at the same time, like, how do we bring in the power analysis part of it where, there are like structural imbalances of power where certain groups based on identities have a lot more power and have had a lot more power historically than other groups. And so it may require power shifts. It may require, so how, and I'd be curious, Tabitha, you're thinking on this as well, because it's just, sometimes there's that tension between, wanting to humanize the other and create alternatives where it's kind of win-win, yet like, how do you grapple with these fundamental power asymmetries which are at the root of so many of our conflicts in the US. So Tabitha, and then folks in the audience, please start to share your questions. I know there's already kind of a robust back and forth going on in the chat, but please feel free to start posting your questions and we'll turn to you in just a moment. So Tabitha.
Yeah, there's so much to respond to in there. I think for me and my work, I see polarization as a symptom that our current working definitions no longer are useful. And I think about that in terms of law enforcement, right? And the utility of law enforcement. I do a lot of work with law enforcement, and there's this clinging to, they hear defund police, abolish police, and they get very, very upset. And it's, no, we can't do that. But when I sit and talk to them about what is it like to put on a vest every day, a bulletproof vest, what's it like to think that you might kill somebody today? Is that what you want? What if you could imagine a future that was like this? I'm like, yeah, that would be amazing. I'm like, then you're actually pro-abolish. And then there's this, this stark moment of realization that it doesn't have to be that way. Or when I'm working with activist communities and I'm like, what if we didn't have to defund police? I mean, we're obviously headed toward abolish, but I'm like, what if we, instead of attacking police, we attack the system with police that makes it so we feel like we have to fight against each other? And there's these realizations in the communities that's like, I didn't stop to think about that larger working definition that no longer works for any of us. So really trying to focus on that is where I find myself. Like I said, I kind of walk between worlds, between being an activist and looking at systems realistically. Yeah, and remind me the rest of the question. My son did something and it distracted me.
Yeah, no, it's no worries. But I think just this question of talking about alternatives and power dimensions. So how do you talk about kind of the power relationships between groups when we want to be able to come up with win-win solutions and we want that people don't have to give things up, but there may be the need for that. So how do you factor in power dynamics into your kind of peace building activism?
Yeah, those are those really difficult, painful conversations with people. I think almost more with the people who have the power, who are going to have to give it up. It's not theirs to hold, and it will be taken. One of the things that I realized last summer when everything happened, I was out speaking, I'm like, the only way that this ends peacefully is if white people get it. If racism ends peacefully, it's because white people get it. Otherwise, it's going to be a non-peaceful ending. And so while I don't devote too much of my time to catering to white people and helping them to understand it, I also recognize that they're human and that there are people, like Peter said, who are reachable, and trying to figure out what is their issue with giving up that power. And that's where being a therapist comes in handy too, because it's a very personal conversation and it's changing hearts and minds one at a time, and then hopefully creating a shared vision that creates working definitions that are more equitable. But ultimately being able to say, yeah, you're right, you are going to lose something in this. You're going to lose power, but that doesn't mean you lose access to resources, which is ultimately why you're trying to keep power, isn't it? And reminding people again of what the ultimate goal is.
Very interesting. Yes, go ahead, Peter. Then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, one quick shout out to, a group of students led by one of our students, Allegra Chen-Corral, did a study of activists, social justice, diversity activists primarily, within different institutions. They studied, I think they did a qualitative project with about 30, and then they did a survey study with about 150. And what they were trying to understand is, what are the things you do and within your institution to reform it? And they came up with sort of 5 categories of activities that people do, depending on how at risk these activities put them, and depending on how much power they have. And the categories of activities were mediate, advocate, heal, resist, and whistleblow. And so what they were saying is that, different people do different things depending on how risky it is for them, right? That a movement needs people that can heal, or that can resist in ways that are not as overt and as obvious and therefore risky for them. And you need people to mediate and facilitate and bring people together. And you need activism, and you need whistleblowers. So they kind of identified this constellation of different activities that activists said they use. Some of them said they move back and forth into different activities under different circumstances. But others say, I don't want to lose my job, but I don't believe in many of the policies of this place. So these are the things I can do, but I'm thankful of my colleagues to be able to do these other things. So again, I think it's important that we start to not think of peace building or conflict resolution and social justice activism as mutually exclusive. I think that they can work together, and I think there's evidence of places where they do work together well.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, honestly, that's the essence of the Horizons project as well, is to try to support an ecosystem where we all appreciate what the other kind of brings to the table and sees kind of these different approaches as mutually reinforcing, as opposed to being, at odds or too different from one another. So we have a lot of questions and comments here, and we will start to turn to those now. So I was hoping, I don't know if it's possible for the person to raise, I see the question, Julia, what does it take to create bridge building for the middle that is sustainable and resilient? So I'll ask that one, and then we'll, have the questioners ask future questions. So Peter, maybe you want to start with that one?
Well, again, I think it just depends on what we, so when I say the middle, I'm talking about this exhausted majority, right? I'm talking about groups of Americans that don't want to do this anymore. And so I think, again, what matters to them is that you provide them with insight and opportunities for other ways to engage. So, let's take the media. So the media is a big part of this problem, right? You get addicted to MSNBC in the morning, you get addicted to Fox News or Breitbart, and they know that, right? The business model of a lot of these entertainment media sources and internet sources are playing on our addictions. So we get addicted to these things, but we also, it's an urgent time. We need to pay attention to what's happening in the world. So find groups like All Sides, like The Flip Side. Find groups that, so The Flip Side is a good example. The Flip Side, it was an organization founded recently that curates, so they take an issue every day and they curate 30 different media sources that are left and right, and they try to identify the most intelligent, nuanced pieces on that issue today. And then they send you a 5-minute read on your email or newsfeed. And these are ways that you can intentionally still pay attention to what's happening in the world, but not get sucked into these, addictive processes that are so pathological for us, for our families, and ultimately for our society. So again, I think that there are many aspects of what people can do, but they just need some guidance as to where they are and what they entail.
Great, and I'm going through the comments here. Auntie, you had a number earlier. I want to just see if you want to address, you made some really great points earlier. You want to speak to them?
Thanks, Maria, and thank you. Very beautiful to listen to, Tabitha and Peter. I'm just amazed at your comments. I was just making reference to Bart Brasma. Julia has worked with him, and he's developed a strategy in Europe where he's suggesting that in a situation where the polarization angles are pushing different directions, if you start to mediate and bridge build, you become the scapegoat and the victim of the situation. Rather, you should be focusing your messages towards the middle to increase the number of people so people feel comfortable retreating from the polarized ends to the center. And I think that works in a situation where you have to manage a polarized situation after an incident or something where people are reacting very quickly, and that can become violent. Where in my observation, it doesn't necessarily understand the need to transform those relationships and heal those relationships. So I just wanted to have your comments on that. Thanks, Maureen.
Peter or Tabitha, do you want to address that?
I mean, I would certainly agree that I think, when I think about people who have middle of the road kind of views or are feeling a little lost in all of it, what I often hear is that they're afraid that if they speak up in one way, that they will be shamed by the ends. And so they remain silent. So it's what can we do to bring the people in the middle to a place where they feel like they can be part of the conversation without being shamed. I've come across a number of people who have views in the middle that, or find themselves in the middle, who are so busy just trying to exist that they don't have the capacity to weigh in because they're so overburdened with other pieces of their life. And again, it can be something as simple as I can't attend this meeting because I'm working, or I've got my kids, or very practical life things that get in the way of people who would contribute richness. So how do we then, especially if you are on the ends, how then do you contribute some of your time, space, and energy to the middle so that they can rise up and be part of the conversation?
Yeah, the only thing that I think I would add, I think I understand the question. And the only thing that I would add is, I think we have to be sensitive to events and timing. One of the things I've encouraged the Biden administration to think about is, Biden ran on healing the soul of the nation and unity, and yet, there's not a lot of energy for that right now. There's a lot of energy on both sides for a fight. The progressives are angry that they've been sitting with Trump for 4 years and they're ready for a fight, and the right feels like this is stolen and they're ready for a fight. And so there is not really a lot of energy right now for that. What there is energy for is the fact that this state of polarization is toxic for us, our families. There's evidence of this, right? Depression is up, anxiety is up, opioid addiction is up. All of these things are up, and some of them are related to what's happening in our nation. And we can't solve any problems unless we push them through with a 51% vote. So I think we have to focus on that first to mobilize people and to start to shift the dynamic. Ultimately, it's not sustainable. We need to deal with these deeper systemic issues. We need to deal with the legacy of white supremacy. We need to deal with the profound inequality. We have the highest level of inequality of any G7 nation, and this is a runaway train. There are these huge structural problems that are part of the problem that we have to get to. But I think the crisis we need to flip the crisis, and we need to focus people on the fact that this is making us and our children sick, and it's derailing us, derailing our nation. That's the urgency that I recommend we focus on first.
I would echo that. And then what I would say is the next step is that we have to use different tools. Again, toxic polarization is a tool of, I think Lisa put it in the chat too, and I said it earlier, it's a tool of not just white supremacy, but all forms of supremacy. So as long as we continue to use these tools, like I said, the master's tools are not going to dismantle the master's house. So we need to look at indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world. We need to look at the things that existed for 10,000 or however many thousands of years that were actually successful, and see if maybe that could put a dent in it. But the 51% is 50% plus one vote or whatever it is certainly not going to do anything to shift the structure.
Lisa, I would be curious if you'd be willing to speak to your comment that you made, because it was another rich one.
Sure. Thanks so much for this great presentation. Very interesting, and grateful for your comments. I think, a number of people have noted this power imbalance, but yes, these structures of supremacy, which set up rights for some people and not rights for other people, is historic. It's not a new thing. And I think that, when we're talking about communication skills and dialogue, we have to center the human dignity first and be willing to sort of name those structures, which is uncomfortable. And it often causes people to say, well, that's not civil discourse if you're naming racism. So it's learning how to name racism without violating the dignity of somebody who says something. And it's that calling in with the calling out. So calling in the humanity of somebody who might be articulating something that's rooted in harm to somebody else. I think our field has tended to sort of back off conflict and back off some of the naming of the racism that and other isms that exist. And I think that that's been a disservice actually for identifying really the structural causes of our polarization in our society. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Peter or Tabitha, did you want to react to that?
I agree.
We don't have to, we can keep going.
I don't know if you saw it. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
No, I agree as well. Go ahead, after you.
I was just noticing Daniel Walk's comment, and it's just really, to me, it's very powerful, because when I think about not just political ideology, but ideology in general, I picture a sphere that there isn't just right and left, but there's all types of directions. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, yeah, there's more than just Republican, Democrat, right, left, good, bad.
Julia Roig, I think you had a question.
Thanks. I mean, I've been taking furious notes and really have enjoyed the conversation. And I think that to this last point, both that Brian just made and Tabitha highlighted, not Brian, Daniel, sorry about that, is how we complexify our understanding of all of these different issues. And so as Peter was essentially noting that there's a whole bunch of different activities that we're going to have to do to really address this problem of toxic polarization, I'm really curious about the actions that help complexify an understanding. And so I think that the tools of kind of media consumption and making sure that, you know, we're understanding two sides of or various sides of an issue because we're consuming different media, but that we're allowing people to be complex too, and not any one thing, which then also goes to our political life, of course, and affiliations. And so maybe coming up with different terms, but there's an act of self-reflection about our own kind of biases, but then there's an act of in our in-groups, allowing for us to be strategizing and organizing and discussing with an acknowledgement of the complexity of all of humanity. And so I'm really curious about the tools and the strategies about allowing for that complexity to really take root.
Great question. Thank you, Julia. Tabitha, you want to kick us off? Oh, you're still on mute.
I am. Julie, can you restate the question for me? I want to make sure that I don't go off task, because there's so much in there that I could go off on.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I wasn't really very pointed in my comment, was I? You know, I'm really, because also you come at this from probably your personal kind of therapy perspective of the process of allowing people to understand and accept the complexity of other people. So it's not just issues that are complex. It's like people have different aspects of themselves that then allow us to engage with them in different ways. And so I've really been reflecting on the process of complexity.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what Daniel was kind of speaking to, right? And that we are not linear human beings. And so we've got to start conceptualizing everything in the way that we, even in education, the way that we teach. Can't be a linear model for understanding. And I think that when we can start to create a multidimensional model for understanding, that's when people might be able to start understanding complexity. When I look at policies and governance in this world, it is very much a linear sort of thing. So how do we even begin to conceptualize a government framework that is non-linear? So I think it becomes really difficult for the human, the individual, to conceptualize themselves or anybody else as non-linear or non-complex. when everything we do in our world is done that way. So I think that that's when, you know, I often call it the wet bathing suit feeling when I'm talking with people in terms of their growth around a particular issue and conceptualizing things as multidimensional, is when they start to get really uncomfortable, like there's something that's wrong here, but like I feel like I'm in the right pool, but like the wrong area. So it's when we start to think outside of the bounds of what we set up as our societal parameters for what's acceptable and allowable. That's when we can get to complex thinking.
Yeah.
And Peter, you've done some thinking on complexity.
Yeah, that is something we think a lot about. So, you know, I think the problem that we're talking about is that a simplistic us versus them thinking, feeling, behaving is fractal. When we're in situations like this, it's within us, it's between us, it scales up to our nation. So there are a lot of different, so that's the bad news. The bad news is that makes it so hard to consider how to unpack that. The good news is that means that there's a lot of ways in. So one way in that I would recommend is there's a piece that was written by a colleague of mine named Amanda Ripley, who's a journalist, and she wrote a piece called Complicating the Narrative. She was funded by a group called Solutions Journalism to take a critical look at journalism. And she spent a year or two, she was trained as a mediator, she came to our lab, participated in our research, she went to John Haid, she did a lot of different kinds of things. And what she came up with is that, you know, reporting is in and of itself part of the problem, right? Because what reporters do is say, all right, here's a conflict, here's this side, here's that side. Let's make it as exciting and contentious as possible. It'll draw attention and we'll get a lot of clicks, you know, and it will go viral. Well, okay, but that's part of the problem of polarization. So what she did is she spent a lot of time thinking about what would be other ways that reporters could do their work that would reintroduce nuance into highly complicated things. So, you know, I think, and there is now a movement through solutions journalism and groups like Flipside and Allside and others that are trying to offer alternatives to change the nature of reporting. But what has to also change is the business model, right? The business model behind reporting, the business model behind the internet, because that's a deeper structure that requires this kind of dichotomous thinking and dichotomous behaviors. But there are many things that we can do. You know, there's a thing called social identity complexity, which is a measure of the fact that some of us have different group memberships that all line up, right? I'm pro-choice, I'm green, I'm progressive, I'm, you know, Democrat, and whatever, and all my identities line up. And if that's true, then I'm much less tolerant of members of outgroups. But if I happen to hold identities that are contradictory, and guess what? We all do, right? We have feelings, attitudes, and identities that are contradictory. The more I'm aware of those, the more I give the other side some slack, right? Or the more I can take different perspectives because I'm used to living in that space. So there are aspects of just ourselves where that work can start, but it then scales up to, again, the fact that we need to either travel to or live in places where you have a lot of mixing, right? Because it is that movement to places to experience others. Again, it's not, you know, just political tourism. It's about spending time with people and getting to know them that matters. But that is another way to complicate your understanding of them, yourself, and the issues.
Great. Thank you, Peter. There's a great question that Julian Portilla made. Julian, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Well, I think it's basically what Peter is talking about. There's a great article in the Atlantic this month about the way that the architecture of the internet has been corporatized and has had the opposite effect of the democratization effect that everybody fantasized about when we first understood what it was. And so I was asking if there's something fundamental about our nature that leads to polarization, or if it's really about the current tools that serve as accelerants for polarization. And so my question was about social media and journalism, but it seems like Peter just touched on that. So I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Well, I will say that again, there is, we do have there is something called homophilia, which is, we're more comfortable moving to those that are similar to us and moving away from things that are strange. There is a kind of basic human, tendency towards that. But these folks know that. And when something is strange, we fear it. And they know that. And so it is the tapping into that and the weaponizing of that is part of the problem. So yes, there is a tendency, Emile Bruneau is a neuroscientist who studied in-group, out-group formation in the brain, and he would just see an image of an out-group and it triggers your amygdala, triggers your fear center. But it can be very easily overridden, right? If suddenly that outsider is also a member of some other community or group that you like or you're associated with, it goes away. So that's why I think we have to move beyond our sort of brainstem behaviors, right? And complicate our world.
Great. So I'm seeing a question by, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Sopnot Halig Baker. Do you want to ask your question? Sopnot, are you there? I'm happy to read it if you prefer not to speak. Well, I'll go ahead and read it. Shifting our habitual ways of being towards less destructive, more dialogic one is acting against the Western individualistic, monological, hegemonic discourse we reside in. These values serve as steroids that sustain a fragmented system. Shifting from individualistic thinking towards the relational space we co-create could support more democratic and inclusive society. It's a mutual responsibility. So Tabitha, would be curious, like your reaction and just this idea of shifting to more kind of relational thinking and organizing.
As a relational therapist, I support that. I endorse that. And I was even thinking about what Peter was just saying, even about in-grouping, out-grouping, and our most basic instincts around that. And then the way that we typically overcome it is by creating a sense of affinity for the other. And my thinking is that we even need to go beyond creating affinity in order to create space for other, or just a basic sense that other deserves the same rights that we do. And that can I love across, in love in the sense of like, we are community and therefore you deserve the same rights I do. Can I create love for people that I completely disagree with, that I have my amygdala is lighting up left and right? And so that's what I hear in this particular statement. So yes, absolutely. That is the way we have to be relationally oriented. Our society exists because we're relational creatures.
It's interesting because, no, go ahead, Pierre. I was just going to say that, we had a conversation with Kazu Haga, the author of Healing Resistance a week ago, and, was talking about how to get to the beloved community and who is included in the beloved community and how do you really express love towards not just an other, but somebody who's really on the other side. And yet that's the new frontier. I mean, that's kind of the healing and kind of transformational aspect of the work. But sorry, go ahead, Peter.
No, I was going to say, I think we have to be careful about, again, setting up dichotomies, Western and Eastern dichotomies, and one being, because obviously you look at some highly collectivistic societies, Myanmar and China, they have, their own problems, right? So it's not about the hegemonic, individualistic center. All human groups need both. They need individuals with a sense of individuals and individual rights, and they need communities with a greater good and an orientation to that. And all of the more healthy societies navigate that effectively. This is not unrelated to, Daniel, someone had a question earlier about liberalism and conservatism, and they're seen as bipolar. And yeah, we've done research on that. And what we find is that people that see kind of left and right more in terms of these dilemmas that groups face, right? So do you support tradition and stability, or, and do you go too extreme on that? Or do you support the need for inclusion and reform and progress? And are you able to hold those things not as bipolar, but as both in some ways necessary things that have trade-offs, right? Over inclusion is immensely inefficient, but over, top-down leadership and decision-making is also highly problematic in different ways. So we have to understand that, and people that do, we find, actually have a much more nuanced sense of the world and hold more moderate opinions. So I do think that we have to be careful about splitting these things off, because every human society has to navigate left and right, or progressive and conservative, and has to navigate self and other, right? Community and other. These are basic human dilemmas. The question is, how do we see them as dynamics, and not this one is right and this one is wrong?
Yeah. Interesting. Prabha, you had a question. And I know we're getting up to the end, so we're going to maybe take a couple of more questions, and then I'll ask Julia and Prabha if they'd like to close us out. So Prabha, please go ahead.
So no, Julia got to my question, Maria, so I'll get to my comments at the end. That was exactly where I was going, and as always, she was right there. Thank you. Let's take more comments and questions. I recognize also there are psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, peace builders in the group. This is an amazing group of participants in the conversation. So there might be more comments and questions. Let's go there.
So there was an interesting kind of exchange, had to do with, I think Lisa was the one to bring up kind of calling in and calling out. And kind of the downside of calling out is that it can shame people into inaction and demobilize them. Yet calling out in kind of healthy ways, if you will, can encourage introspection and can encourage kind of reflection and growth. So I'd be curious, Peter and Tabitha, how do you kind of engage with this topic of calling in versus calling out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So when Tabitha made her comments, I was thinking about the film Color of Fear, which I imagine many folks are aware of. I don't know how pervasive it is these days, but back probably 15 years ago, it was a stimulus for reflection on dialogue and race and power dynamics. And it was a very powerful stimulus. And what I remember about that is it was an encounter group of men, different races, and what the white men kept saying is, I'm not comfortable with how you're talking to me, and what some of the young men of color said is, so I need to talk like you in order for you to be comfortable with us talking, and really sort of challenge what's the privileged way of encountering one another here. And it was always a very powerful stimulus for conversations about that, and how do you correct that, and how do you work with that effectively. And again, it does come back, Maria, to your question about power. And when there are these powerful assumptions, like what is respectful and disrespectful dialogue, right? I think that's really something that we as a field need to interrogate very carefully, because our assumptions, even as a mediator, I often thought about this, that what do we privilege in mediation? We privilege people that are articulate storytellers, right? And are persuasive storytellers. And so if someone's, second, third language English, they're one down already, right? And so I think we have to be very careful at reflecting on how those things influence us as interveners, influence how we set up dialogue processes. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I see these things all wrapped up.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Tabitha, did you want to talk about kind of this? And we were talking about this early in the context of the brain trust and the research on the Horizons project, like how to grapple with this notion of calling in and calling out, but curious how that shows up in your work.
Well, I see them both, right, as useful depending on the circumstance, but they can also be limited. So whatever I choose to do in the moment, the way that when I'm working with people, I say, thinking about, what is your ultimate goal and which one you choose to use in that moment. And thinking about, like Peter said, the power dynamics in the room. If you are way down below, you may try to call in, or you may try to shout it from the rooftop because you've been, thrust into this void of non-being into which you are trying to, escape. So the way that I kind of conceptualize them is that, what is going to be the fallout or the backlash from which one I choose in the moment. I try to do calling in more right now because the community is so fractured in so many ways. But it's highly dependent on the relationship. And interestingly, Peter, I went out and met with Lee Moonwa and the folks that did the film, and fascinating. I spoke to Victor, who was the gentleman that said, you know, we're standing on red ground, the one with the incredibly powerful call out.
Yeah.
And the ways that his life has been impacted by his decision to do that and have it filmed is incredible. The blowback that he got from people who were so fragile at just watching him on video do it really had profound effects for his life. So I really have a lot of respect for him for saying what so many of us couldn't, but we all feel that same rage that he did.
Sure.
Thank you, Tabitha. So this has been a fascinating exchange and could undoubtedly go on for another hour plus, but we're getting towards the end of our time. And Prabha, I know that you wanted just a few minutes, but I also wanted to ask Julia if she wanted to make any comments from a Horizons Project perspective before we turn things over to Prabha.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just a very quick thank you to all three of you. That was just fantastic. And we knew it was going to be a great combination with all of your inputs, and it truly was. And thanks to the audience. I just wanted to highlight for the group here that the Horizons Project is convening together with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, more domestically focused group, May 5th, our next conversation, which is also a part, you know, the Trust Network is engaged with the working group at the Alliance for Peacebuilding as well. We're all trying to amplify each other's efforts at this point. Please check out the Alliance for Peacebuilding's web page, because every Wednesday between now and the end of May, they're gonna have a series of conversations. And we're gonna be hosting a conversation on sacred values and the narratives of democracy. And so we've been talking about how much words matter and how we could potentially reach out to those who potentially are allies or think differently, because of the narratives and the story telling that we use that hopefully can be grounded in our sacred values. That's going to be the next conversation. So stay tuned. May 5th, we look forward to continuing these wonderful conversations with all of you. So thank you so much, Prabha, and thank you to the Trust Network team for all of your wonderful collaboration in putting the conversation together today.
Thanks so much, Julian. I'm just adding my thanks to Peter and to Tabitha for their just really wonderful reflections and insights on the conversation. And thanks to everyone. Thanks to the Trust team for all their work on the program. And thanks to you all, the audience, for showing up and having such great questions and comments. So I'm going to let Prabha close us out today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a richness to this that cannot end now. So because I know we are partners, and because I know that there are people who are working in community in actually doing a lot of the work that Peter, you and Tabitha and Maria have been talking about, I would love to continue this conversation with some very practical applications. Part of what you have talked about is that, you know, I think of it as this eco space in which many of us work. You called it the constellation of activities that are necessary. And that is so critical, because what we know from family systems theory, and there seem to be many of us who are therapists here, is that when systems are stressed, they regress to binaries. And our task as peace builders is really to pull out of those binaries and open the space to think beyond dichotomies and binaries. And the reality is we have the processes and the tools. And so it feels like it's a time for a lot of that to come together in the very unique way it's possible in this country, and with the learnings from others, and with, as Tabitha said, a reawakening of indigenous practices and cultures of pluralism. I mean, there is a wealth of what is possible in relation, in community, in indigenous practices. So we hope to continue this kind of a conversation, and I think to also see if we can plan one where we will have an opportunity to hear about what works in a very practical sense. I mean, there's so much of what you've talked about that is research-based, but I know that all of it is also based on the deep experience with which all of you come. So with that in mind, I want to underscore Julia's recommendation for the series. So the Alliance for Peacebuilding is the policy partner, if I may, in the Trust Network, the top down and bottom up. There are centers here from around the country, and there is the Alliance for Peacebuilding that takes our recommendations to the administration. And we've been extraordinarily impactful this time, because as Liz will say, my job as a lobbyist, even for this fun work, is really great when it's falling on fertile ground as it is right now. So I encourage all of you, we'll put that in the Trust Network dispatches. We're trying to highlight a whole series of social cohesion and security related activities and inviting policymakers so that they are able to hear that the landscape in the US is a rich one indeed, filled with possibilities that they should be funding. Finally, I will say there is a, let me put the last one up, and I'm sure Marcella will be sending this out also. The next in the series, in our effort to continue to share our resources about how to complexify conversations, how to have conversations without making them into simplistic binaries. The next one coming up is on what you need to know to be able to have or facilitate a sane conversation about guns in this country. And we all know that is a part of what's going on everywhere. And the last one after that is Jesse Morton. You might be familiar with Parallel Networks. He's been working around the country, around the world, and is coming back to the US to do, has been back in the US, frankly, but is coming back to do a lot of work around domestic, not just de-radicalization, but really coming from a trauma-informed perspective to address what's going on in terms of the conditions in this country at this time. So we hope you will come back for those conversations. And I'm 3 minutes over. So thank you again, Maria, Julia, Peter, Tabitha, for sharing your afternoon, and to all of the others. And happy birthday, Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you all.